Jim Baker. My question is about a sensitive topic, so it's important to lay some groundwork. I am a Bernie bro and an ally of the LGBTQ community. I do have an unpopular opinion with regards to trans athletes, namely that they shouldn't be competing with cis athletes. It's obviously unfair. And when you sacrifice fairness in sports, it kills the sport. There is an easy solution: a massive expansion of sports categories. An open category where athletes can compete regardless of gender seems to be the best solution. This has the benefit of both preserving the fairness of sports and preserving the inclusiveness toward trans athletes. What do you think? Edit. Just saw AOC is worried about genital examinations. Took about 10 seconds to realize DNA can be tested from a single hair. I love AOC, by the way. That hot button rhetoric is sure to get people reacting emotionally rather than thinking logically. I prefer a more objective assessment. Premise one, premise two, conclusion. If you disagree, show me your argument. Okay. Pay attention, everybody. You're going to want to see this. I find it interesting that at the end of your question, you claim to prefer, as you describe it, more objective argumentation, logical. Premise one, premise two, conclusion, which suggests that you want your arguments to be rooted in not only in logic, but presumably in evidence, in some kind of empirical basis, because anybody can throw out a premise and then throw out a second premise and then say, therefore, right? So you want to be able to back up what you're saying. You want your premises to be rooted in reality, to not just be logically consistent, but to be consistent with reality and to be backed up by some empirical evidence. So given that, I also find it interesting and kind of hilarious that your argument for why trans athletes shouldn't be allowed to compete with cis athletes is it's obviously unfair. Is it? Why is that? Why do you say that? What is the logical and also evidence-based argument that it's unfair for trans athletes to compete with cis athletes? What is the evidence? What has led you to this conclusion? And I'm honestly, I will be honest here. That's not entirely a good faith question on my part, because I'm really not interested in hearing what you have to say, because I'm fairly certain, based on my own research, that there is no argument in favor of what you're saying, that not only is it not obviously unfair to allow trans athletes to compete alongside cis athletes, but there is no evidence to suggest such a thing, certainly not on any kind of a scale that we as a society should be fucking worried about it. There's a word, actually a two-word term for the kind of thing that you are engaging in here. Not just you, and I'm not even saying, and I don't think you are knowingly doing this, but you are definitely doing this, you and a bunch of other people. And that word is moral panic. The concern that people have for the fairness of allowing trans athletes to compete with cis athletes is a moral panic. It is a hysteria based on nothing. And I want to say that again, because I really think that's the truth. It's a hysteria based on fucking nothing. You show me the evidence. You show me the examples that establish that when trans athletes compete with cis athletes, they have established some kind of domination of the sport that they are competing in that is freezing out the cis athletes, that is so radically altering the level of competition, that it is now so lopsided in favor of the trans athletes that the cis athletes have no chance to compete. You find me one fucking sport where that has ever happened. Name 5 trans athletes in the entire world. I know there are many more than 5, but just name 5 trans athletes in any sport in the entire fucking world. Because honestly, off the top of my head, and you know, like I said, there are many more than this, but off the top of my head, I can only think of 3 right now, and 2 of them are no longer active. One of them is Renee Richards, the famous tennis player who transitioned, who is a trans woman and transitioned back in the 70s and became the first notable uh, professional athlete to transition. And she continued to play tennis as a woman at back, 40 years ago. And the other one, of course, is Caitlyn Jenner, who competed her entire sports career before she transitioned. The other one, the only active one, or at least only recently active one I can think of, is Leah Thomas. And she is also the only one that I can think of, the only trans athlete I've been able to find of any note anywhere who has not only been allowed to compete, but has actually won something. She is the first and so far the only out trans athlete, trans man or trans woman. She's a trans woman. She is the only openly trans athlete to ever have won an NCAA Division I championship in any sport, in any event. One trans person won one event in one division of a collegiate sports organization. So what is the danger here? I've done some research. I researched this last year when I did a video about Leah Thomas, when all of this came up, because bigoted transphobes lost their fucking minds because one trans woman won a thing competing against cis people. Didn't break any records, by the way, except for school records. That's something else I looked up, because there's a part of this moral panic is, men are pretending to be women, and these trans women are competing in women's sports, and it's unfair, and they're breaking all the records. I couldn't find a single record other than like school records. And again, the only one I really found of those was Leah Thomas. I couldn't find any national records, any Olympic records, any world records in any sport that have been broken by trans athletes. So why is it obviously unfair? What am I, as the average person who cares about some sports, doesn't give a shit about other sports, why am I supposed to be upset about trans athletes competing against cis athletes? What is the threat to cis athletes? Because so far, there isn't one. All I see when I look and when I try to find evidence for these claims, when I try to see if there is anything underlying this hysteria, this moral panic about trans athletes, all I find are examples from right-wingers who are trying to spread the panic of trans athletes who have been allowed to compete. I see websites with really sensationalist headlines that make claims that are not remotely backed up in the actual article, where they say things like trans women are competing against cis women all over and they're breaking records while they do it. And then I see the quote unquote evidence that is offered in the actual article beneath the headline. And it's just examples of trans athletes being allowed to compete. And occasionally, maybe 1 out of 10 or 20 might actually have won something. They're not breaking records. They're mostly just being allowed to compete. And apparently, that's unfair. Even though it certainly hasn't driven cis people, men or women, out of sports. It hasn't led to any trans dominance of any sport. All I hear are cis people who don't play those sports, and probably for the most part don't even care about those sports, trying to whip up some anti-trans hysteria, using the sport as an excuse to promote transphobia, to promote bigotry and intolerance, which you are unwittingly, I'm going to be charitable and say unwittingly contributing to. You say you're an LGBTQ ally, then stop saying this shit. You say you're an LGBTQ ally. Well, then stop promoting this bullshit, baseless moral panic about trans people competing with cis people is unfair. Look, maybe it would be more fair to have non-gender specific sports categories. I don't fucking know. I don't think about it. I don't really spend that much time on it. It's not that important to me. Maybe that would be more fair than the system we have, but that's not the point. The point is there is no reason to consider changing it on the basis of trans people being allowed to compete against cis people, because this fear of trans people being allowed to compete with cis people and dominating their sports has failed to come to fruition in any meaningful way. It is made up bullshit. It is the bigoted fantasy of a bunch of sick, hateful, intolerant people who are just looking for another reason to get clueless, foolish, gullible cis people to hate on trans people and try to stop them from gaining equality and deprive them of things that make them happy and give their lives meaning and make their already fucking horrible slog through this shitty life that the rest of us have made for them even fucking worse. But as I said, if you have any actual fucking facts to back up your hysterical bullshit claim that it's obviously unfair for trans athletes to compete against cis athletes, I would be interested to hear it, because I've noticed something, and I'll say this and then I'll move on to the next question. I've noticed this thing that happens, because look, I can't claim to be an expert on this. I haven't conducted any serious long-term deep research into this, right? So it's possible I've missed all of the evidence that establishes that it's obviously unfair for trans people to compete alongside cis people. But I have noticed this thing. When I encounter a claim and it smells like bullshit to me, and then I look into it and I can't, and after not heavy research, but several hours of looking into it, and I can't find any evidence that it's true anywhere, it's probably going to turn out to be bullshit. It's possible that I've just missed all of the evidence, but I'm not betting on it. I'm betting if there was real compelling evidence to suggest that trans people, if allowed to compete with cis people, would, completely alter the landscape of sports and cis people would no longer be able to compete. I'm pretty sure if there was genuine evidence of that, all of the transphobes who are trying to run trans people out of everything would be sharing it ad nauseum, but they're not, which leads me to believe that it's not fucking there. That instead of evidence, what we have is some transphobes who are trying to use this to contribute to the persecution of trans people, and also, in a few cases, some cis athletes who lost to a trans person or felt unduly challenged by a trans person, and now they're being fucking crybabies about it because they haven't figured out that in sports, sometimes you lose. And usually you'll be losing to other cis people, but every once in a while you might lose to a trans person, maybe. But that's how sports works. You can't always fucking win. Sometimes you lose, and you're supposed to be a good loser, not a sore loser. And you being a fucking crybaby sore loser because a trans girl happened to be better than you in a sport or in a particular event of a sport, that doesn't give you the right to declare that all people like that should not be allowed to compete against people like you. Fuck that. Fuck anybody who thinks that, and fuck anybody who is saying these ridiculous, just baseless things and expecting to be taken seriously and saying things like, oh, it's obviously unfair. And then you have the fucking audacity at the bottom of your question to say, I prefer objective assessment and logical arguments. What the fuck, man? What the fuck? If you are an LGBTQ ally, then fucking think about it and fix your fucking head. It's bullshit, Jim. It's fucking bullshit. Genuine LGBTQ allies don't drop that credential and then spread the kind of baseless fucking horseshit that you did in that question. Moving on.